Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive deep.
Always.
Today, we're tackling the future of energy, and we've got this fascinating report as our guide, Future Energy Sources, Sustainability and Moral Responsibility.
Mm.
It really gets into the nitty-gritty of
Uh-huh.
how we transition to new energy sources, but more importantly, it asks, are we doing it right?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Is green tech always ethical? What about the folks whose jobs depend on fossil fuels?
This report doesn't shy away from those tough questions.
Not at all. We all love the idea of renewables, right? Solar panels, wind farms.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what about the materials? Where do they come from?
You hit the nail on the head. For example, think about electric car batteries, solar panels. They all need these rare earth minerals like lithium, neodymium.
Right.
But getting those materials often comes with a cost, a real cost.
I was just thinking that.
Like environmental damage from the mining, sometimes even human rights issues.
Yeah, the report talked about.
The report specifically mentions cobalt mining in the Congo, where, sadly, things like child labor and worker exploitation are a big problem.
So it makes you think even green tech can have
A dark side, absolutely.
a dark side.
And it's not just about the materials. Even building those huge solar and wind farms can have a big impact on the environment.
Oh, absolutely.
You're talking about displacing communities, messing up ecosystems.
Remember that whole controversy around palm oil for biofuels?
Oh, that's a perfect example. We thought we were doing the right thing, but ended up causing deforestation. Good intentions aren't enough, you know?
It really makes you wonder, are there ways to do this smaller scale, something more community-focused,
Well, that's an interesting thought, and the report actually does touch on that. Have you heard of microgrids?
Microgrids, no.
So they're like these mini power grids. They can operate independently from the main grid, and they can run on renewables like solar or wind.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, they're especially well suited for rural areas or places where getting connected to the main grid is difficult.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I imagine there is still some kinks to work out. Can they be reliable? And what about the cost?
Those are good points. And the report does acknowledge that microgrids aren't like a magic solution. They need upfront investment, and they might not work everywhere, but they could be really transformative, especially in developing countries where grid access is limited.
It's like every solution has its
Trade-offs.
trade-offs.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about renewables and their complexities, but this report also digs into another tricky topic, nuclear power. It's often presented as this low-carbon alternative, but there's always that shadow of safety and waste disposal looming over it.
Right. That's the dilemma with nuclear. On one hand, it's super efficient, generates a ton of electricity without directly pumping out carbon emissions. But then you have the risk of accidents, like Fukushima, and the problem of what do we do with the radioactive waste?
The report mentioned a few different methods for dealing with the waste, right? Like burying it deep underground or even reprocessing it.
It did.
But is any of that foolproof, really?
That's the big question. And the honest answer is there's no such thing as zero risk when you're talking about nuclear waste. Every method has its pros and cons, and even scientists and policymakers can't agree on which is the safest long-term.
Feels like we're leaving a pretty heavy legacy for future generations to deal with.
No doubt about it. Our decisions about nuclear energy today will have repercussions for centuries, literally. That's why it's so important to have these open, honest conversations about it, weigh the risks and benefits.
So fission has its issues. What about fusion, then? The report made it sound almost like a clean energy utopia. Limitless power, all from seawater. Is it really all that?
In theory, fusion is amazing, replicating what powers the sun. If we could crack that, we basically have unlimited clean energy. Problem is, we're still decades away from making it practical.
So it's more like a long-term,
It's a long game, yeah.
long game.
There are massive technological and scientific hurdles to overcome, and whether we can do that in time to actually address our current climate crisis, that's still up in the air.
So as cool as it sounds, we can't exactly bank on fusion to swoop in and save us.
Not just yet. We got to focus on what we can do now. Scale up renewables, become way more energy efficient, and fundamentally change how much energy we're using. It's got to be a multi-pronged approach.
Makes sense. All right, let's switch gears to another potential renewable source that caught my eye in the report. Bioenergy. Using algae or biomass for fuel sounds kind of sci-fi, but is it legit? Or are there, hidden downsides?
Bioenergy has the potential to be carbon neutral, for sure. But as with everything we've talked about so far, there are trade-offs to consider.
There always are, aren't there?
Always. So, for example, if we're using land to grow crops for fuel, does that mean less land for growing food?
Oh, good point.
Especially when you consider that food security is already a major concern globally, with hundreds of millions of people facing hunger.
It's like we're picking between fueling our cars and feeding people.
Exactly. And the report really stresses the need for careful planning and sustainable practices with bioenergy. Maybe instead of using food crops, we could focus on agricultural waste or energy crops that don't compete with food.
So it's about being smart and making sure bioenergy isn't making the food problem worse.
Right.
Are there any other environmental impacts to worry about?
Deforestation is a big one. If we're clearing forests to grow those energy crops, that kind of defeats the purpose, right? Think about what happened with palm oil. It was supposed to be sustainable, but it led to massive deforestation, wrecked ecosystems, hurt communities.
Another example of good intentions gone wrong.
Gone wrong.
Gone wrong. It's like a reminder that even when we're trying to do good with renewable energy, we got to be careful about the unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It's about looking at the whole system, the full life cycle of our energy choices, from the beginning to the end.
Okay, so we've talked about specific energy sources and their ups and downs, but I'm also curious about this bigger picture of sustainability. The report kept emphasizing that it's not just about the technology, it's about how we approach the whole transition.
It is. It's a whole system shift.
Like, what about resource extraction, for example?
Resource extraction, you mean getting all those materials we need for these renewable technologies?
Exactly. The cobalt, lithium, copper, all that.
Yeah, and the demand for those things is just going up and up as we're trying to build a clean energy economy.
Mhm.
But if we're not careful, we could be creating new problems as we're solving old ones. It's what the report calls the green paradox.
The green paradox. Now, that's a catchy phrase. What's that all about?
So it's the idea that in our rush to go green, that huge increase in demand for these minerals might actually lead to even more destructive mining, even more human rights abuses.
So we're solving one problem
And creating another.
and creating another, yeah.
That's why the report stresses the importance of something called a circular economy.
Okay, now that term I have heard, but break it down for me. What does a circular economy mean for energy?
It's like thinking about the end from the very beginning. We got to design our energy systems in a way that those materials can be reused, recycled, repurposed. We're closing the loop.
So instead of, take, make, use, dispose,
Right.
it's more like a continuous cycle,
Exactly.
which makes total sense, but also sounds like a huge shift. Do we even have the infrastructure to actually recycle things like solar panels and wind turbines on a large scale?
We have a lot of work to do there. The recycling infrastructure for this stuff is way behind.
So if we don't figure that out soon, we're going to end up with a mountain of e-waste, even from green technology. Kind of ironic, huh?
It is, and it highlights how important it is to think about the whole system, the entire life cycle of these technologies.
All right, so we've got resource extraction, the circular economy. But what about the human side of all this? How do we make sure this shift to clean energy is fair, that no one gets left behind?
That's where the concept of energy justice comes in. It's making sure everyone benefits from the transition.
So it's not just about clean energy, it's about clean energy that's
Equitable.
equitable, yeah. What are some key principles of that?
Well, first off, everyone needs access to affordable, reliable energy, regardless of where they live or how much money they make. Remember that statistic we talked about?
Yeah.
Millions of people around the world still don't have electricity, and billions more are using dirty fuels to cook and heat their homes.
It's a reminder that this transition isn't just about emissions. It's about fundamental things like
Basic human rights.
human rights.
And energy justice also means acknowledging that some people might actually be hurt by this transition, people whose jobs depend on fossil fuels.
Right, like coal miners.
Exactly. We need to make sure those folks have opportunities to retrain, find new jobs, that their communities aren't just abandoned.
So it's about recognizing that
There will be winners and losers.
there will be winners and losers and making sure those who might lose out are supported.
Exactly. And making sure they have a say in how this transition happens. It has to be a democratic process.
This is getting pretty complex.
It is. It's not simple at all.
It's not just about swapping out power plants. It's about whole systems, social, economic, political, all intertwined.
And that's why the report is so valuable. It emphasizes that holistic view. It's not just about the tech. It's about the people, too.
Okay, so we've got energy justice, but there's also this whole geopolitical side to consider, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shifting away from fossil fuels is bound to create ripples on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. The energy landscape is deeply intertwined with global politics. A major shift like this is going to have major consequences.
What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, for one, think about the petrostates, countries whose economies depend heavily on oil and gas revenue.
Like Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. Places like Nigeria, Venezuela, they could face real instability as demand for oil drops. Their whole economic model is built around it.
It's like pulling the rug out from under them.
In a way, it is. So we need to be prepared for that, have plans in place to help those countries diversify their economies, find new sources of income.
So it's not just about finding alternative energy sources. It's about navigating
A whole web of
a whole
transits.
web of transitions. Yeah, wow.
It's a lot,
It's a lot to think about.
but it's important stuff. It's going to affect us all in one way or another.
Well, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a ton of ground already, from specific technologies to the global implications of energy transitions.
We have, but there's even more to come.
Oh, absolutely. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
And we'll be back soon to dive even deeper into the ethical and philosophical questions surrounding the future of energy.
Can't wait.
Stay tuned. Okay, so you've just heard us lay out some pretty weighty ethical dilemmas, but let's not get bogged down in despair. This report isn't just about problems, it's about solutions too. And I think one of the most interesting ideas it explores is this concept of a circular economy for energy. What does that mean to you?
A circular economy for energy. It's all about closing the loop. You might be thinking, wait, isn't solar and wind already renewable? And you'd be right. The energy source is, but what about the technology itself?
Ah, good point. We've talked about the materials needed to build solar panels, wind turbines, batteries.
Mm-hmm.
That stuff doesn't just magically appear, and it doesn't disappear once the tech is outdated.
Exactly. Right now, we're on a pretty linear path. Extract resources, manufacture, use, discard. A circular economy flips that. We design products from the start with their end of life in mind, making sure materials can be reused, repurposed, or recycled efficiently.
So it's kind of like nature, right? Waste from one process becomes food for another. Nothing is truly thrown away.
A great analogy. And it's not just about environmental benefits. A circular economy can create jobs, boost innovation, and even make our energy systems more resilient.
Resilient.
Think about it. If we're reliant on constantly extracting new materials, we're vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, price fluctuations, and geopolitical instability. But if we're reusing and recycling within our own economies, we become more self-sufficient and less exposed to those risks.
That makes a lot of sense. But let's be real, shifting to a circular economy for energy is a huge undertaking. It's not just about individual companies changing their practices. It requires systemic change, right?
Absolutely. We need governments to create policies that incentivize circularity. Think things like extended producer responsibility, where manufacturers are responsible for the end-of-life management of their products, or tax breaks for companies that use recycled materials.
So it's about creating the right incentives to make the circular economy more attractive than the linear one. But what about us, the everyday folks? What role can we play in all of this?
Don't underestimate your power as a consumer. When you buy new electronics, look for brands that prioritize repairability and use recycled content. Support businesses that offer take-back programs for old electronics, and advocate for stronger recycling regulations in your community.
Those are all great ideas. It shows how individual choices can ripple outwards and contribute to larger systemic change. But let's face it, sometimes it feels like these big problems like climate change and the energy transition are just too big for us to solve.
What do you say to people who feel overwhelmed and powerless?
I understand that feeling.
Yeah.
It's easy to get discouraged when you look at the scale of the challenges we face.
Yeah.
But here's what I always come back to. Despair is not a strategy.
Ooh, I like that despair is not a strategy. It's true. Giving up doesn't help anyone.
Exactly. We need to channel our concern, our anger, our frustration into constructive action. And the good news is there are so many ways to get involved.
Okay, give us some ideas. What are some concrete actions people can take to make a difference? First, let's talk about political action. Call your elected officials, write letters, attend town hall meetings, support candidates who champion clean energy policies. Your voice matters, and collective action can create real change.
So it's about making sure our leaders know that climate change and the energy transition are top priorities for voters.
Absolutely. But political action isn't the only way to make a difference. We can also support grassroots movements and organizations that are pushing for change. Look for local groups working on renewable energy projects, energy efficiency programs, or environmental justice initiatives.
So it's about finding ways to plug into the amazing work that's already happening in our communities.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of individual choices. Every time you choose to bike instead of drive, buy energy-efficient appliances, reduce your meat consumption, or switch to a renewable energy provider, you're sending a signal to the market that you demand a more sustainable future.
It's about putting our values into action in our everyday lives, making those small choices that, when multiplied by millions, can create a ripple effect of change.
I love that, a ripple effect of change, because ultimately that's how we'll make the energy transition happen. It's not about waiting for someone else to solve the problem. It's about each of us doing what we can, where we are, with the resources we have.
So it's about individual action, collective effort, and never underestimating the power of small steps to create big change.
Precisely. And it's also about staying informed, staying engaged, and never giving up on the belief that a better world is possible.
Okay, so we've talked about the circular economy and individual actions, but this report also delves into a topic that I think a lot of people are curious about: the role of big tech in the energy transition. I mean, companies like Google and Amazon have made some pretty ambitious commitments to clean energy. Are they the heroes we need, or is it all just greenwashing?
Greenwashing, it's the bane of any genuine sustainability effort. And to be honest, it's something we need to be very wary of when it comes to big tech.
Okay, break it down for us. What are some of the red flags we should be looking out for?
First, watch out for vague or misleading claims. If a company boasts about being 100% renewable, but relies heavily on carbon offsets that don't actually reduce emissions, that's a sign of greenwashing.
So it's about looking beyond the headlines and digging into the details of their claims. What else?
Pay attention to their lobbying efforts. If a company claims to support climate action but lobbies against policies that would actually reduce emissions, that's a major red flag.
So it's about watching what they do, not just what they say. Actions speak louder than press releases, right?
Exactly. And finally, look at their investments. If a company claims to be committed to clean energy but invests heavily in fossil fuel infrastructure, that's a clear sign of hypocrisy.
So it's about aligning their financial interests with their stated values. But how do we as consumers hold these companies accountable? I mean, they're so big and powerful, it can feel like our individual actions don't make much of a difference.
That's where collective action comes in. Support organizations that are tracking corporate sustainability claims and holding companies accountable for greenwashing. Engage in boycotts or pressure campaigns when companies engage in unethical practices. And use your voice on social media to amplify these issues and demand better from the companies you support.
So it's about using our collective power as consumers and citizens to push for transparency, accountability, and genuine action from these corporations. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of governments. What kind of policies and regulations are needed to create a more just and sustainable energy future?
That's a crucial question, and one that the report addresses in detail. One of the most effective policy tools, and one that's gaining increasing support around the world, is carbon pricing.
Okay, carbon pricing. We hear that term thrown around a lot these days. Can you remind our listeners what it means and why it's so important?
Essentially, carbon pricing means putting a price on carbon emissions. This can be done through a carbon tax, where polluters pay a fee for each ton of carbon dioxide they emit, or a cap-and-trade system, where the government sets a limit on emissions and companies can buy and sell permits to pollute within that limit.
So it's about using market mechanisms to incentivize the reduction of emissions.
Exactly. By making polluting more expensive, carbon pricing encourages companies to invest in cleaner technologies, improve energy efficiency, and transition to low-carbon alternatives. It also generates revenue that can be used to fund clean energy research and development, support a just transition for workers and communities, and invest in climate adaptation measures.
It sounds like a win-win. Reducing emissions while also generating funds for a cleaner and more sustainable future.
Yeah.
But I know that carbon pricing can be politically contentious. What are some of the arguments against it?
One of the main criticisms is that it can disproportionately impact low-income households if it's not designed carefully. That's why it's crucial to have policies in play that mitigate those impacts, like using revenue from carbon pricing to provide rebates to low-income families or investing in programs that help them reduce their energy consumption.
So it's about ensuring that the transition to a low-carbon economy is equitable and doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities.
Exactly. And there are also concerns that carbon pricing could make businesses less competitive, particularly those in energy-intensive industries. But the report argues that these concerns are often overblown and that well-designed carbon pricing policies can actually stimulate innovation and create new economic opportunities in clean energy sectors.
So it's not about stifling the economy. It's about shifting it towards a more sustainable and resilient model.
Precisely. And ultimately, the costs of inaction on climate change far outweigh the costs of implementing these policies.
That's a crucial point. We can't afford to delay action any longer. The climate crisis is already upon us, and it's only going to get worse if we don't act decisively. But carbon pricing isn't the only policy tool in the toolbox, right?
Absolutely not. The report highlights a whole range of policies that can help accelerate the energy transition. This includes things like renewable energy portfolio standards, which require utilities to generate a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources, feed-in tariffs, which guarantee renewable energy producers a fixed price for the electricity they generate, making it easier for them to compete with fossil fuels. Energy efficiency standards for buildings, appliances, and vehicles, which reduce energy consumption and lower emissions. Investments in public transportation, cycling infrastructure, and electric vehicle charging stations, which make it easier for people to choose cleaner transportation options.
It's a pretty comprehensive list, and it shows that there are many different pathways to achieving a cleaner and more sustainable energy future. But ultimately, it's going to require political will, international cooperation, and a commitment from all sectors of society to make this transition happen.
You're absolutely right, and that's why this report is so important. It's not just a technical document, it's a call to action. It's a reminder that the energy transition is not just about technology or policy. It's about the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of future we want to create for ourselves and for generations to come.
That's a powerful message. And it brings us back to the ethical dimensions of the energy transition that we discussed earlier. It's not just about reducing emissions. It's about creating a world that's more just, equitable, and sustainable for everyone.
Exactly. And I think that's a vision that can inspire us all to act, to innovate, and to work together to build a brighter energy future.
We've talked about some pretty big systemic solutions in this deep dive. Carbon pricing, international agreements, tech innovation. But, it also makes me think about something we touched on earlier. The idea of energy colonialism. It's not enough to just have clean energy. We need to make sure everyone benefits fairly.
You're right, it's a crucial point, and the report spends quite a bit of time on this. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of new technologies, but we can't repeat the mistakes of the past. Just because something is green doesn't automatically make it ethical.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't encountered this term before, can you explain what energy colonialism is and why it's a concern?
Imagine this. A European country trying to meet its renewable energy goals decides to build a massive solar farm. Sounds good so far, right? But instead of building it at home, they strike a deal with a country in North Africa. They lease vast tracts of land, often displacing local communities, build their solar farm, and export the energy back to Europe.
So on the surface, it seems like a win-win. Europe gets clean energy, and the African country gets investment and jobs. But what's the catch?
The report highlights that these deals often end up being exploitative. The profits flow out of the host country, the jobs created are often low-paying and temporary, and local communities have little say in how the projects are developed or managed. It's a continuation of colonial patterns, just with a green veneer.
So it's essentially another form of resource extraction where wealthy nations benefit at the expense of less developed countries. It's almost like a clean energy land grab.
That's a good way to put it. And it's something we need to be very vigilant about as the demand for renewable energy grows. We can't allow the clean energy transition to become a new form of colonialism.
So how do we prevent that? What can be done to ensure that the transition to clean energy is truly just and equitable, not just within countries, but also between them?
First, we need transparency. These deals need to be negotiated in the open, with full participation from local communities and civil society groups. We need to make sure that land rights are respected, that local communities benefit from the projects, and that they have a voice in how these projects are developed.
So it's about ensuring that these projects are truly partnerships, not just transactions where one party dictates the terms.
Exactly. And it's also about building capacity in developing countries, helping them develop their own renewable energy industries, and create jobs and economic opportunities for their own people.
So instead of just extracting resources and exporting energy, it's about empowering these countries to become self-sufficient in their own clean energy transition.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that the clean energy transition is not just about technology. It's about justice, about equity, and about building a more sustainable and equitable world for everyone.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We started by exploring the promise of new energy sources, but we quickly realized that it's not as simple as just swapping out fossil fuels for renewables.
Right.
We have to consider the whole picture: the ethical sourcing of materials, the social impacts of energy production, the geopolitical ramifications of shifting energy landscapes, and the moral responsibility we have to future generations.
We've covered so much ground, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. But I hope our listeners are walking away from this with a sense of informed empowerment.
I agree. Knowledge is power, and understanding these complexities is the first step toward taking meaningful action.
Exactly. This report wasn't meant to provide easy answers. It's a call to ask difficult questions, to challenge assumptions, and to engage in thoughtful and informed debate about how we create a just and sustainable energy future.
Well said. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to take action, what would you say is the most important takeaway from this deep dive?
I would say it's this. The future of energy is not predetermined. It's a future we're creating together, one choice, one action, one conversation at a time.
That's a beautiful and empowering message. We each have a role to play in this transition, whether it's reducing our own energy consumption, supporting clean energy policies, holding corporations accountable for their actions, or advocating for energy justice.
And remember, even small actions can make a difference. The ripple effects of our individual choices can create waves of change that transform our energy systems, our communities, and ultimately our world.
So to everyone listening, keep asking those tough questions, keep diving deep, and keep believing in the power of collective action to create a brighter, more sustainable future for all. Until next time.